So today I want to talk about Catcher in the Rye, my environmental analysis of the book. My thesis is like so. I postulate that Holden's environment did not give him very many opportunities to express who he really is on the inside, and how important the people in his life, like his peers and mentors, are unable to properly connect with him, and that is why he ends up in the state that he is in the novel. I believe this to be the truth because throughout the novel, his interactions with the people around him deeply affect him, from his talks and fights with his peers to his with his mentors and his talks with family and even random conversations he strikes up with the strangers around him. The first section I would like to talk about are the peers that surround him on a day to day basis. On a day to day basis, Holden is surrounded by many of his peers around his age, and he often talks to them a lot. One of the more interesting discussions with peers that he has is with Sally, where he and her actually spent a lot of time talking and walking, but they never ended up connecting really. They were originally on a date with each other, but the closest they got was baring teeth at each other after Holden's relatively outrageous claim of going away with her, essentially running away up to Massachusetts or Vermont, although Holden's distaste for her is realistic since she was actually talking it up with another dude while she was on Holden's date. So you might say that she was responding to an outrageous claim, to which in a way she was in their dinner scene, where Holden asks her to get the hell out of here, driving to Massachusetts and Vermont. Quote from the book. To which Sally responds, "You can't just do something like that, and we're both basically children, and we would starve to death." Other two are quotes from the book. But my counter to that is that just scenes before, after the theater play, Sally started talking about a lot of people they both knew with the boy from the Ivy League school. Quote from the book. The other discussion that you might use as a counter to the fact that his peers were mostly bad is the case of Carl Luce. Carl Luce was a classmate of Holden's back in the day, and they met at a bar just to catch up. Holden and Carl talked about their lives and women, and even though Carl was reluctant in a lot of the things that he said and talked about, and often said stuff like the typical Caulfield conversation and the typical Caulfield attitudes, he ends up saying some interesting stuff. Carl talks about having Caulfield go to his father, who could help him recognize the patterns of his mind. In another way, he feels that Holden needs some help, which is, in my mind, the most helpful thing that someone says to him, really. Everyone in the story just kind of warns him about his fate and tells him to apply himself, but Carl specifically gives him the advice that could end up helping him help himself in the long term without losing his temper, even though Carl has shown his distaste for Holden's antics. Although, if you were to state that as a counter, then I would use one of the first interactions Holden has in the book with Stradlater, one of the jock types from his school. Stradlater was a fair guy, but he had done some bad stuff to Holden within the book. So, my first example would be when Stradlater asks Holden to write up a composition for him, knowing that Holden was flunking a lot of classes. Holden, out of somewhere in his heart, decided to do it anyway, and he ends up writing a heartfelt composition about his late brother Allie and his baseball glove. But when Stradlater comes back to see it, he goes on a tantrum, almost saying, and I quote, "What the hell's the difference if it's about a baseball glove?" Quote, and no, quote again, "No wonder you're flunking. You don't do one damn thing the way you're supposed to," end quote. Stradlater simply does not see the worth in the composition and gets angry at Holden for not writing a quote unquote good composition. And in doing so, he ends up hurting Holden's feelings pretty bad because that in fact was a poem that he had written from the depths of his heart about something that he really cared about. Now that we can see that his peers from the story are pretty bad, we can go on to talk about his mentors in the story. He has mentors in the story that only offer vague advice as to what his fate will be, and when they come to him to tell him how to get around it, every time the answer ends up being to apply yourself. because both teachers don't really get Holden enough to really say much more about his situation. The first mentor we meet in the story is the history teacher named Mr. Spencer, who originally wanted to meet Holden so he could speak with him before Holden is officially sent away from Pensy. And their meeting starts well, with good intentions, but ends rather negative and vaguely. When they initially meet, he starts talking about Holden and his grades, and later on, he becomes more and more unhappy. And finally, he kind of hits Holden with the question of how Holden himself feels about it. He asks, quote, "Do you feel no concern for your future, boy?" End quote. And when Holden responds half-heartedly, the response is, quote, "You will, boy. You will when it's too late." End quote. And, quote, "I'd like to put some sense in that head of yours. I'm just trying to help you if I can." End quote. The teacher says that he wants to help him, but he never actually reaches the core of any of Holden's issues and just warns him, really. What help did he really give? None, really, beyond a vague warning. The next mentor we meet is a bit more kind, but he also gives other more vague warnings. His name is Mr. Antolini, a friendly English teacher. Holden meets him in his apartment, and Antolini makes many remarks as to how well versed Holden is in English, and how he feels like Holden could be a lot more. But when it comes down to advice, it's the same old stuff. They talk, discuss their lives, and Mr. Antolini tells them this time that, quote, "This fall I think you're riding for. It's a special kind of fall, a horrible kind. The man falling isn't permitted to feel or hear himself hit the bottom." End quote. And that, quote, "You're going to find out where you want to go, and you've got to start going there immediately." End quote. Mr. Antolini suggests that Holden go to school so that he can help get experiences and ideas, and that it would help him in where he wants to go because he loves knowledge. But once again, Mr. Antolini gives relatively specific advice, but no advice on how to help Holden understand himself, which I believe to be the largest problem within the book. Holden not understanding himself, not completely. And Antolini doesn't really give any advice to it beyond the small comment of him or Holden loving knowledge. Now that we've covered his peers and his mentors, we can go to, I believe, one of, if not the most important aspects of the story: how harmful the environment around him is. Or not necessarily inherently harmful, but rather extremely unfortunate based on his circumstances. One of the first things One of the first strangers we meet is the taxi driver that drives our titular character away from the bus stop to a hotel. Holden attempts many times to create a small talk with the driver, and the driver systematically denies him of it each time. We see in the story many times that Holden likes to talk about the ducks in the lagoon near Central Park and what happens to them when the lagoon freezes over. When Holden proceeds to ask the question to the driver proceeds to respond, quote, "What are you trying to do, bud?" End quote. And, quote, "Kid me?" End quote, with hostility. He also turns down Holden's request for a drinking partner. As we can see here, the driver probably could tell that Holden was not in the greatest state, especially after the drinking partner question, but still proceeds to walk away. One of the other strangers we meet, and possibly the more traumatic experience, is Sunny the prostitute and her pimp, Maurice. Originally, Holden hired Sunny to simply talk to her, but when this was revealed to Sunny herself, Holden, Sunny herself was unhappy, and while she took the cash that Holden was supposed to pay, she ended up leaving unhappy, and things took a worse turn from there. She states that, quote, "What the hell did you tell that crazy Maurice you wanted a girl for then? If you had just had a goddamn operation on your goddamn, what'd you call it? Huh?" End quote. And this is right before Sunny leaves in a distressed rage. Then Maurice too enters and creates a ruckus with his chatter and decides to take the money from Holden's wallet along with Sunny because Maurice decided to hike the price up since Holden treated the service unfairly in Maurice's eyes, even though all Holden really wanted was someone to talk to. Maurice talks, or the book says, quote, I was still sort of crying. I was so damn mad and nervous and all. And Holden begins to speak. You're a dirty moron, I said. You're a stupid chiseling moron, and in about 2 years from now, you'll be one of those scraggy guys that come up to you on the street and ask for a dime for coffee. You'll have snot all over your dirty, filthy overcoat, and you'll be. End quote. And these are the final things that Holden says before he too gets decked in the stomach by Maurice. Overall, Holden spent his time in a world that didn't want to get to know him, never wanted to help him, and was always cruel and cunning in every way possible within this book. Holden tries many times within the story to connect with people, and it is only successful, in my mind, two times. Once with Carl Luce, who is able to provide him some proper advice as to his situation, because Carl simply seems to be an intelligent being, and his sister Phoebe, who he actually managed to reconcile with at the end of the book after disappointing her earlier on about his leaving from Pensy Prep. Overall, I believe that Holden was just in a very, very unfortunate situation in that he was unable to grow as a person from the situations around him, but rather grow from very small and lucky encounters. Thank you.